Hey everyone, this is Bathymetrics, and today I'm doing a continuation of a video I put out yesterday. It's number 30 in my producer tutorials series, and it was about the fastest way to create tasty bass drops in Bitwig. Everything I'm talking about today builds upon all the stuff I showed you yesterday, and it was a pretty deep dive into a special workflow technique. So I really recommend you go back and watch this video if you haven't seen it yet, so that everything I'm talking about today makes sense to you. Otherwise, you're going to be like, what's Bathymetrics on about? Okay, so the basic idea of yesterday's video is I showed you how to quickly create something called a mud pie. Through a creative sound design session where you basically take a synthesizer like Phase Plant and you run it through a whole bunch of creative processing effects, and you end up with crazy things that sound like this. Where there's an original patch. And then you can hear that I've started doing strange things to that patch. Right? And I did all of this strange effects processing with Portal. So Portal's a grain. Stop that. Portal is like a granular effects processor that throws in all kinds of other interesting things: time stretching, delays, pitch movement, all kinds of crazy movements. So it's a great sound design device. So you create these mud pies, and then you drop them. The main point of yesterday's video was showing you how you can drop them into Serato sample. And, this is a 1-minute mud pie that has some cue points already set at interesting places. And let's see, I probably need to do that now. Where's my sound? Where's my sound? All right, I'm hearing you. I'm hearing you. You're on, you're on, you're on. Let's switch over here. I'm obviously doing something. There we go. It just wants to respond to my keyboard instead. Right, so I've loaded the mud pie into here, and I've got it mapped to 16 keys on my push controller, 16 pads rather. And then you can play in real time against a basic kick snare pattern and a sub pattern maybe if you want some extra bottom feels. And then I played this in real time like an instrument, and just quickly in about 3 minutes came up with 2 simple pattern ideas that can sound okay. Okay, so that's one way to quickly get a bunch of timbres. Oops, let's turn this off. It's one way to quickly get a bunch of timbres and sounds that are all related to each other timbrally. Obviously came from the same source, little variations of each other. And of course, depending on what you do in the mud pie, they could be really crazily different in some ways. Like you can go out into left field and change pitches and do all kinds of stuff. But regardless of what you do in the mud pie, it's all built on the same original key frequencies and the key spectral balance. And so there's always a kind of relationship between the sounds. And a lot of times you want that in a drop. You don't want every single different sound that you play in a drop groove. You don't want them to be completely disconnected from each other. You want some relation so that people can hear that those 3 voices that you're using, those 3 sounds, are kind of like little variations of each other. That's what keeps things coherent and cohesive and kind of, sounds like it belongs together. It's part of what makes a good drop pleasant sounding. But you don't want every sound in the drop to be the samey, obviously from the same original source. You want some contrast too, because it's contrast that makes for interesting stuff. So I wouldn't normally build my drop sections out of these chops as they are. I would use them as the root of my arrangement. I would take and render these out to audio, and then I might start chopping out, like, the second bar in here, the second beat, or a few beats or something. I would chop them out and replace them with something from a completely different chop groove I had rendered to audio. And I would be mixing and matching sounds. I would be interjecting other sounds in here. So Serato is great for the fast workflow I showed you yesterday, but it's not perfect. It's not everything you need. And so today I'm showing you the other thing you need, which is to go ahead and use Bitwig's own drum machine. Now, yesterday I made a big deal of explaining my drum machine, and using it was a little tedious, but today I'm going to show you how to get around that tedium and make it actually work for you with this same kind of workflow. And what I said was wrong with drum machine yesterday is if you just take a mud pie like this and you do, stop that. If you take a mud pie like this and do, I guess I can't do it from this mode. Can I do it from here? Right, slice to drum machine. I showed you what was wrong with slice to drum machine because it'll take this mud pie and chop it up in a way that isn't really useful to us. And then it'll stick it across like as many pads of a target drum machine as we want. But it does it in a way that it kind of populates every pad with a brand new sampler. And when you right click and check any of those pads for their choking behavior, by default, all choking behavior is off. And then you would have to walk through and manually like set up every single pad one by one to be choked by every other pad, because you typically want these sounds chopping each other off. You don't want one key that you're still holding down to still be playing when you play a different key, a different pad. So the trick, the answer to this is to create a special version of a drum machine beforehand and actually have it sitting in your user library ready to go. And here's my preset. It's called Chop Machine. And the trick is to pre-populate the pads you're going to want to use with an empty sampler. So every one of these pads in the first 16 slots of the drum machine, right here, they have an empty sampler. Now, if I get up into a different set, there's no samplers there, there's no samplers below it, but by default on my push, when I grab a track that has a drum machine on it and start playing it, my drum machine layout starts here on C1. Oops, let's get the right thing in here. Here's the chop machine. So you can see I'm triggering my first pad on my push, second pad, so on, all the way up through the first 16 pads. And it's C1 through whatever this is by default. Now, I typically don't like to make big, huge drum machines, even though I have 64 pads on my push. I like to work with 16 pads for drops because 64 is just too many to remember. I like to come up with riffs and patterns that I can remember in this simple 4x4 layout. So if you create a drum machine and put an empty sampler in the first pads that make sense for you, the first pad slots that make sense for you. And then you come to every single pad and start one by one and do right click, choked by, and you choose all, right? If I clear this, for example, this is what it would look like by default, and none of these little circles would have a checkbox in them. But if you just come up here and say choked by all, it's going to look at every other pad that has a sampler on it and just automatically say, yes, set all these to have a check mark, which means every other pad will choke pad number 1 that I clicked on, right? And so then we can come over here to pad number 2 and do the same thing, choked by all. And then we can come over to pad number 3 and do the same thing, choked by all. And you just do this. It's a pain in the butt, but you only got to do it 16 times. And once you've done that, right click on this and save the preset to your library and give it whatever kind of description you want. And now you have a thing you can just drag out of your library every time you want a new, empty, ready to go chop machine that is already set up to have all these sampler pads choked by every other sampler pad. in this first set of 16. Okay, now once that's done, you can now start doing interesting things like this. So, we made these mud pies out of a single sample, but let's grab some totally different sounds. So over here in my sound design track, where I have an E1 note ready to just loop and play over and over for a bar at a time. On that track, I've added 2 other polygrid devices that sound a little different. One of them is just a simple triangle wave that's been bumped down an octave. The other one is a swarm oscillator that's a little bit higher pitched. And I like to do my sound design in a single instrument selector because then I don't have to keep creating new tracks and remembering which track to turn the recording on for and, constantly creating new clips to play into the track. You can just have one track, one clip with the right note you want. And if you want to get different things out of it, you just pick a different lane or channel or layer in the instrument selector. So here's what this polygrid sounds like. I just activate it by clicking that yellow button, and it sounds like this. And right now it sounds like that because it's this triangle wave being fed into a copy of Portal that's active, and Portal's doing some interesting stuff to it, right? And then here in this lane, I'll select it. That's the swarm oscillator. And let me turn Portal off now and show you what that would sound like. Right? So I can get these 2 different bounces into a sample really quick by doing this. I'll select the first triangle wave, I'll turn on Portal again, or whatever processing I might have added to make this sound the way I want. And you just select this clip. I've just left-clicked it to select it, and now I do Control B to bounce. Pre-fader, 32-bit, nothing fancy, hit enter, and boom, I have a new audio track with a bounce. And here's what it sounds like. Hey, exactly what we had up here for a bar, and it'll just keep looping perfectly over and over. So let's retitle this and call this bounce 1. Now let's do this again. Let's come back up to the sound design track. Let's pick the polygrid that has the swarm oscillator in it. Let's turn off Portal, select this, and do Control B again. Enter, boom. Now we have a bounce that has that swarm oscillator, and it's not being affected by any post-processing. Okay, so far so good. Let's name this one Bounce 2. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is load these clips into our chop machine, our drum machine. So how do we do that? You don't want to try and drag this clip down to the drum machine and then let go. That'll work, but it'll replace the sampler, I think, or it might not even work if it's a clip. Typically, the way you want to do this is come to the track that has your bounce you want and double-click the clip and look at what the name of the audio event is, Sound Design Bounce 11, and come over here to your project button in the lower right. Click it, make sure you're on the Files tab. By default, it's here. You want to be here. So we're specifically looking for Bounce 11. That's this one here. And then if I click this clip, we can see that that has Bounce 12 in it. So basically, scroll down here to your chop machine, and let's put bounce number 11. We're just going to drag it down and drop it right onto the pad of the drum machine. And you can see it's loaded into the sampler. And you don't have to worry about changing the root pitch, even though this was recorded at E1. You can just leave it at the default because we don't have key tracking on. And so regardless of which key I hit on my keyboard, it's always going to play this pad at the raw tuning of the bounce, right? That's the original thing we recorded. Right? And it doesn't matter if I change this to a completely different value. Hasn't changed. And the reason it hasn't changed is because this isn't on. If this is on, then suddenly all bets could be off. because this is a C1 key, so now it's going to sound very different. Like you can't even hear that. That's subsonic because I changed the tuning. Let's drop this way, way, way down and play it now. Right? So because this is off by default, because there was no pitch information in the title of the sample I dragged in here, you don't really care about this root key. You can just Control A, what was that, C3 by default? You know, you can just leave this alone and ignore all this because it's always just going to play the bounce you did, right? And then we're going to take this waveform here and drag it over here into sampler number 2, pad number 2, and now we have this one, right? And so because we had already preset this up to have the right choking behavior we wanted, if we double check the chokes, we can still see it's being choked by every other pad, right? So by predefining this and saving it as a preset so the choking behavior was set up, you can drag any sample you want either directly onto the pad where a sampler is, or I could have drug it directly into the sampler window if I wanted. And either one will be fine. The choking behavior stays solid. So now I have a drum machine that will let me play these two chops just by pressing the keys. And they'll choke each other. If I hold down the low note and press the higher note, it just instantly chops off the low note, right? And vice versa. Right? And there you go. Now, what if you want to get out some of the chops from Serato and add them to this mix? By the way, I'm probably going to rename these and say S1, just for sound 1, just to show that's populated with something. I'll click S2, so I got sound 2. Now let's say I wanted to get one specific sound out of this Serato chopper. You could, the easiest way to do that would be to grab an empty slot somewhere and double click. And let's maybe change the color of that just to show that it's a special one. I'm going to double click and go find E1, because that's what I did all these at. And then I'll use a shortcut key to just double that, double that, double that, and double that until I have one full bar of an E1. That's the way I like to do it. And then I can use this one E1 key to be playing something in Serato sample. Now, you can probably guess what's wrong with this because these keys here are all tied to the incoming keys on my drum machine. So this is C1 here. Let's make sure this is record enabled. All right, so that's a C1, C2, or C sharp 1, D1, D sharp 1, and so on. Right? So what I really want to do before I set this note is go look at the chop I want to get a sound out of. Like I've got a G sharp 1, a C2, and a C sharp 2. And this is what it sounds like. Play you real quick. So let's say I wanted this C2 note and I wanted to pull this out and put it in my drum machine. So all I have to do is come over here to this clip and just set this to be C2 instead. Let's just take it up an octave, select it, go up, and then down to C2. Right, so you can just click here and see what's what. Pick the thing you want to sample. So in this case, I want this one. Right? So I've got this set to a C2 clip. And now I can take this and bounce it. Control B. Enter. Done. Here's that clip. Now, there's an interesting thing about bouncing inside the clip launcher. If I play this clip, do you hear how it's actually 2 bars long and it repeated itself right in the center? That's because when you bounce in the clip launcher, it's trying to capture what tail, if you've got effects processing, reverb, delays, whatever, that are still operating on this clip. and the clip loops around to the beginning again, you want that reverb tail or delay tail or whatever kind of tail might be on the sound. You want that to loop cleanly right into the front of the clip again. So Bitwig is smart. When you bounce a clip in the clip launcher, it actually makes a double length version of it, and it sets it up to be, here's the first part that played, and if there was any kind of tail, you would actually see the tail spinning into the next second round of the recording. You would see this look a little different right here. And they actually set up the clip to start looping at the beginning of the second recording, where there might have been a tail that's bleeding into the start of the clip from the end of the clip, right? So by default, Bitwig will always set it up to play this part of the loop, and the whole thing is here with the tail bleeding through from the end of the first iteration into the start of the second iteration. So how do you fix this so that it works a little better in a drum machine? Well, on the one hand, you could not care, and you could just use this kind of as it is, but it'll still act weird because if I find this Serato chopper bounce 1, which is this one here, and if I were to drag this into a drum machine, it's actually going to start playing it from here at the very beginning of the waveform. So what I might want to do, and I might want that, but let's say you wanted it to be this part of the waveform that you start from that has the looping tail already built into it. Now, there's a couple ways to do this, but the easiest way is to just select the clip, look over here in the clip launcher, and decide whether you want the first half or the second half. And just change the behavior of it. Turn off looping. Decide whether you want it to be starting at the second bar, right? Starting here and coming over to here. You just do it with the start and stop values. Or I could say, no, go ahead and start at the first bar like normal, but stop after the second bar. And so now the start point is here, the end point is here. And whether or not you have looping behavior is up to you, but you could turn looping on and simply say start the loop at the first part, right? And let the loop go for exactly 1 bar. So you can totally modify this to be the behavior you want. And then the problem still is, again, this is in the clip. The clip controls what's happening with the underlying audio event, but you haven't changed the audio event itself. If I drag this audio event right here down into the drum machine, it's not going to know any of this looping stuff you set up, right? It's not going to know which half you picked. It's just going to play it from the beginning of the audio event right here. So the trick, the thing I want you to remember, is that you want to do one more bounce after you've set this up. You want to set the length to be the way you want it. You want to make sure that it's stopping at the point you want it. So you could either, drag this loop marker over manually, or you could just set it up here with the start and stop values. See, even though it's grayed out, I can set it to stop it at the end of bar 2, or I can come up here and set it to stop at the end of bar 1 right here. But get this set up the way you want. So you're looping the half of the clip you want. And then just come here and do another bounce. Control B. Boom, done. Now this clip is only 1 bar long. And you can tell that by if I try and make the start and end longer. Come on. I have to turn off looping to do this. Turn off looping, drag you out a little bit. And now if I try to, drag the audio event further out, it won't go any farther. So this particular audio event, Serato Chopper 2 Bounce 2, is exactly 1 bar long, and it's the piece that I wanted. It's the loop that I wanted. So I can just come find this one, Serato Chopper Bounce 2, and I can come down to my chop machine and just drag this one into a new pad. And let's call this Sound 3. And now I have this one working the way I want. So let's make the chop machine work again. Flip to my drum pad layout, and now I have. All right. So that's enough for this video. You can see the basic pattern is any kind of sound design you want. You can bounce directly while you're here in the clip launcher. Bounces are easy. Just have whatever kind of clip with the behavior you want. Bounce it out, click the clip, find the name of the actual audio event inside that clip, come over here to your Files tab, find that same thing, and then just drop it into your pre-built drum machine. Wait, this one. Drop it onto the right pad in your pre-built drum machine that's keeping your choking behavior the way you want. Don't even worry about the tuning or anything like that, because you just want to play them raw at whatever you bounce them at, and you're done. And you can build yourself a custom drum machine with sounds from all over the place, where some of the sounds are closely related and maybe came out of the same mud pie, but other sounds are coming from a completely different source, and you're good to go. You can build up the same kind of drum machine that you can play in a human way with your own timing and your own groove against, some background drum beat, some background sub or 808 pattern if you want. And you can come up with really interesting chops really quickly. But this time you're doing it with Bitwig's drum machine instead of just all doing it inside of Serato sample. So this is the full picture for this. It's the same kind of workflow, just two different tools, two different results. You can get to this result pretty quickly once you know a few simple things about how to bounce inside of the clip launcher, and most especially how to take what the clip launcher does by default, which is double up any MIDI you've got. It'll make it twice as long, but you can come in here and just figure out which part you want to loop, which half. And then once you've got it set up that way, you just bounce it one more time and use the wave file that ended up in that bounce. That's the one you want to use. Okay, hope this has been helpful. Hope it gives you a complete picture and gives you some ideas for your own production. Thanks for hanging with me, and I'll see you next time.